Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am so excited to kick this off with this keynote speaker. I have seen the inside of Matt Poepsel's brain, and let me tell you, he has got some incredible stuff to share with you. Just motivational leadership. How can we become better leaders in our own community? So without any further ado, I'm going to let him take it from here. Everybody welcome Matt Poepsel.
Well, thank you so much, Jordana. I appreciate that so much. And when Jordana asked me to give a talk about transitioning out of military service, I had done 6 years in the Marine Corps, but it was quite a long time ago. So it made me a little bit nostalgic. And when I thought back to my holiday season, 5th grade. And I thought about when I went under the tree and I grabbed a gift, big box, and I ripped it open. I was so excited. It was exactly the present I wanted. It was a toy race car track. And I'm a little bit older, so it was pretty basic as far as this toy goes. Don't laugh, but you would plug it in, and they were called slot car racers. And you'd snap together the little track, and then it would look something like this. Let me see if I can get this going here. So we have it looked like a figure 8 track, real simple, right? And the little red and blue cars were going to zip around this thing, and it was so invigorating to be able to squeeze the little trigger on the thing and just watch the cars go around. It was like magic. I really loved it. And so a couple of years ago, I was talking to my son and I showed him a YouTube video of these original slot car racers I loved. And he looked at me and he said, "Dad, that is pathetic." I was like, "What?" He said, "No, man, check out this PlayStation." And he showed me the controller. It's got like 15 buttons on it and all these kinds of things. And I thought, I don't know. I kind of like the simplicity of the racetrack that I had. It was kind of a more of an engaging experience for me. And as I started to think back, 5th grade is also when I decided that I wanted to be a Marine in the first place. I knew I wanted to join recon, and I would sit there in my spiral notebooks and I would flip through them, and I would draw the little golden jump wings. I knew I wanted to go into recon and do that kind of thing. And it's a little bit young, to have that mindset. I came to find out later, but it's absolutely, I knew what I wanted to do. And so that was pretty interesting. And what I decided is that this sort of a racetrack analogy also is going to be used for us today when we talk about the metaphor of kind of journey through military experience and making that transition. And so what I promise for you today, by the time we're done, I'm going to give you 2 keys to making a successful transition from military life to civilian life. I'm also going to give you 10 principles. This will serve as our roadmap together, so you can take a look at the principles along the way. And I'm going to give you 1 bonus item that's just a bonus insight that we'll talk about as well. And so the first key that I want to talk about is focus. I would say that in terms of my military service, this is sort of the overarching theme that I brought to my career, and it really began in boot camp. So for me, boot camp meant going out to San Diego, California. I was a Hollywood Marine, as they're known, and I actually had a pretty enjoyable boot camp experience. I was at a stage in my young adult life where I knew I needed it. I had a lot of potential, but at the same time, I didn't have a ton of discipline. So I was really looking forward to the process of going to boot camp, and I didn't even mind the food. It wasn't that bad. But what I did think, there was one thing I didn't like, and that was reveille. Frickin' reveille every time. Throwing trash cans, drill instructors yelling, disturbing my sleep. I just never could get over that. I was a pretty high performer in boot camp. I was the first squad leader. There was the guide that was ahead of me, but then I was kind of number 2 of the whole platoon there. And so one night I went to the guide and I said, "Look, I have a deal for you. You run the watch shift and you have to fill it out and make people do watch, and they always grumble, grumble, grumble. I will take watch every night. Every night I'll lose an hour of sleep to stand watch, but you got to give me the last one right before reveille." He said, "You know what? That sounds fair to me." So I ended up talking him into this. And so instead of having the trash can and banging around, I would have one of the recruits come over to me and say, "Hey, it's time for your shift." I'd be like, "Oh, it's so nice to see you. This is fantastic." And so that brings me to this one, which is all about priorities. To me, my bigger priority was having a restful way to wake up on my own terms almost, as opposed to having that extra hour of sleep. So I want to see in the chat, if you will, which would you have chosen if you were me? Would you have chosen based on your own preferences? Would you choose sleep or would you choose peace? Just write sleep or peace, one or the other in the old chat. I just want to see if I'm kind of a lunatic about this. Sleep. Oh, somebody wants extra sleep. Maybe it didn't bother you so much to get woken up. I like that. A little bit of peace and sleep. So I'm seeing a mix. That's great. I appreciate that. And so I think that the question for you, and you're going to hear me tell some stories today, but really this is all about you. You're the one who's got this opportunity. you've got the opportunity, but at the same time, you've got the situation where you're going to be going through this type of transition. So my question for you when we talk about priorities is, are you clear about what matters to you most? I talk to a lot of job seekers and I say, well, are you looking to work? Tell me about the kind of job you're looking for. And they say, well, I don't really care. I'm just looking for some good work. Like, okay, do you want like a big company or a small company? It doesn't really matter. It actually makes it harder for somebody like myself to connect people with jobs when there's almost nothing to go on. If they said, no, I definitely want software and I'd like it to be a mid-sized company, you're like, oh, great. Actually, now I can actually, start to think about that a little bit. So the question for you is simply, are you clear about your priorities and, going into various aspects of your next life? Whether it's your work format, where you're going to be living, and are you prepared to give whatever you're going to have those sort of non-negotiables, really become a part of the mix. So that was my boot camp experience, and it really taught me about, fighting for what was most important to me. And after that, I went to my first, what they call the A school, I guess, which is my primary MOS training, which for me was becoming an Arabic linguist, learning Arabic language out in Defense Language Institute, Monterey, California. And after that, I got my fleet assignment. And so my first fleet assignment was all about going to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So I was there for about 3 years. And as soon as I walked up to Radio Battalion, where we all went, I knew that I wanted to be in recon, as I said before. So they have a radio reconnaissance team, and they get to do all kinds of fun stuff, but you have to try out. So when I got there, they said, okay, you got to do the tryout. And part of the tryout is physical, the part is mental, psychological, but you have to prove that, you're worthy of this investment to get into this kind of elite group. And part of the opportunity or the test that you had to do was a 10-mile hike with an 80-pound pack for time. So you had to do it in I think it was less than 2 hours or something. So hot, sandy, out in Camp Lejeune, and had to get this thing done for time. And so I was doing the hump, and I felt my feet were getting warm. I thought, uh-oh, I've still got a long way to go. And it wasn't just like, oh, that's a little warm, like pleasant. No, this was not pleasant. But I could not stop. Obviously, I was not about to have been in 5th grade drawing doggone jump wings on my freaking my little spiral notebook just to give up. So I continued on, and on Friday, this was on a Friday morning, they gave us the rest of the day off afterwards, and I sat down, and things don't get better when you take your boots off after something like that. By the next morning, both of my feet, the bottoms of them, had blistered so badly and eventually came off over the course of the next 2 weeks when I get back to actually started the real training. And it was extremely painful, but at the same time, I knew I would not quit. And so what happened in this case, I'm talking about passion. I was so determined to get into that elite group because I had that in my mind for as long as I could remember. There was absolutely nothing that was going to stop me. And I needed every bit of that, when I was going through it. The other thing I learned, and because we're all friends, we've known each other a long time, I'll tell you that to defeat friction in your feet when you're in a situation like that, I found out that pantyhose actually work really well. And so I ended up, for the second time, you had to repeat that to graduate the program. And I did much faster and much better when I was able to get that friction. So thank goodness for pantyhose. Who knew? The other thing was when I got out to, I was accepted into the recon program. It was time for me to go to Fort Benning, Georgia. So I showed up at Fort Benning, and this is for a jump school, airborne jump school. So I was about to get my wings. And so what's amazing when you're doing any sort of this parachuting, at least in the recon teams that I was a part of, and for a lot of parts of the military, it's known as a static line jump. So there's basically a tether that comes and it pulls your parachute for you. So you don't have to worry about that like you do with recreational or Halo or any of these other types of parachuting. So it pulls it for you. And then when you're on the ground looking up and you see like an aircraft come by and people have come out the doors or they come out the back of the ramp, there's these big poofs, and it looks really, really cool. What's not so cool is if you rewind the clock to about 2 hours before that, everybody's on this field sitting around on their packs waiting for the aircraft to either to show up or to be ready, and it's pretty boring. And what's funny is when I was in, we were wearing woodland camouflage, and you're in the middle of the field, you're the most visible thing going. Like everything else is camouflage except you, even though you're wearing camouflage. And you're sitting around and you're basically like rolling around on your pack, and something could come loose, because you're kind of doing your best, but it's hard. When you board the aircraft, the helicopter, and you sit down, now all of a sudden your back is against the wall. And so when the command comes and they say, stand up, hook up, and approach the door, before you go, there's this sound off or equipment check. And so what happens is the person who's second to last watches as the very last person in the stick, as it's known, turns around so they can inspect their chute. And they'll say, okay, you look okay. Nothing's come loose. You're fine. And then they turn around and they'll inspect the person in front of them, and they'll slap them on the behind because you can't really hear much and you can't see much. So you got to feel that tactile bang. So, okay, all the way up front. And then they say, all okay, jump master, we're ready to go. And this is all about preparation. So what happens is when you go through and you didn't pack your own chute, there's a specialist called riggers and they pack your chutes for you, and something could happen. If you have your static line draped around your arm instead of over your arm, that could cause an injury. Like, you can't have any of that stuff. So preparation is really key. So again, just as we talked about with priorities, and you're making this transition, are you clear about your priorities? Are you clear about your passion? What makes you like your again, those non-negotiables for you? And then when it comes to preparation, are you taking advantage of the tools and the resources that are made available to you? Jordana mentioned that talking about purposeful in terms of making a purposeful transition. She mentioned in the opening tools and job fit tools. Like, there's a lot of great resources out there to prepare you. And when I was going through the transition, I had some people that were with me that were kind of waiting till the last minute. And I started my preparation because I knew I was going to separate. I started about a year prior, and I'm really glad that I did, because it took me a lot of attention. It doesn't mean you need a year if you've got less than that coming up, but it's just a matter of saying, take that roster down and understand, are we where we need to be in terms of that type of preparation? So I did earn my gold jump wings. I got a chance to jump C-5 and C-130 aircraft, as well as helicopters where you don't even have to go out a door. You just kind of drop off a skid, and that's all fine and good. And then when I got to my first assignment, I was on the USS Incheon, and we went to the Red Sea, and we were parked off the coast of Mogadishu, Somalia. And my very first sort of real field service was part of a UN peacekeeping mission that was Operation Continue Hope. And so I show up and I'm ready to do my real Marine stuff. I've been in for almost 2 years at this point, going through all my schooling. And I'm like, I'm ready to go ashore. Let's go. And they said, absolutely. Here's your powder blue beret and your powder blue armband to go with it. It says UN. I said, I'm not putting that stuff on. I just earned all this uniform of mine. I get to go be a real Marine. They said, yeah, Marine, put this stuff on. I said, okay. So I went ashore, and I realized that we were actually part of a multinational contingent for the UN. There were service members there from just about any country I could think of. At the airport, I met the Canadians. And I walk up and I said, we're not going to talk about the powder blue beret, right? And they said, no, absolutely not. We freaking hate it. I said, me too. But started to talk to them about their training. A lot of similarities. Talked about their culture of the military. A lot of similarities. When I went downtown in Mogadishu and we started to talk about the security forces and the patrolling the roadblocks and stuff, the Egyptians were there. And I got to actually try some of my Arabic, and they appreciated the effort. It was probably pretty poor, but they were kind about it. And it was just amazing to share those stories. And when I started to think about it, I'm like, how in the world do all of these militaries come together and figure out even the basics of communication and coordination, logistics? I mean, somebody could get hurt if we're just not clear about these things. And that really taught me this next item, which is all about partnership. And so when I started to realize that we all are similar, but we're different ways, we have to communicate. That was true in the military. When you think about your own transition, one of the key questions that comes up is, what type of partnerships do you have in place, or can you create when it comes to making this sort of move? Maybe you're going home to family, as I did. When I got out, I went straight home and moved in with my bride's mom. And that was one part of that support system, but that wasn't helpful on the employment side. I had to go find other partners. So whether I know there's people on the call, people in this event who are willing to help you with the recruitment, get your resume together, all these kinds of things. Those are great partners. And I think you have to be creative sometimes about how you strike up those partnerships. You have to enlist people to help, because when you get to the outside, it's not the same as in what I experienced in Mogadishu, where they said, okay, you will work together and here's some people and you should probably chat. It's like, okay, that was all kind of infrastructure that was there for me. You get to the outside, it's like, people are busy. They're doing their own thing. You have to actually build your support system and your crew around you, especially in the employment domain. So partnership was really important for me, in that regard. And then finally, when it came time for me to separate from military service and I went through the TAP program, I'm sure it's similar in some ways to what I went through, and probably different, hopefully in other ways, because not that it was bad, it was just fairly basic when I went through. And I sat down at one of these little desks and bumped my knees, and I took the Myers-Briggs, I think it was, the personality assessment, trying to match me with jobs. And there wasn't a ton back then. And this was kind of before there was the internet and lots of good stuff like LinkedIn. But what I found is that it is a marathon, not a sprint. It's not like you just line everything up and you get out of service and you're done, you're ready to go. I remember that I felt very excited about the possibilities of what would come next. I had enough arrangement that I knew I was going to be going back to school, which was exciting, but not right away. But I got the U-Haul van and loaded it up, and my bride is still upset because I packed it so badly I couldn't take her favorite couch with us. I mean, these are the little things you remember. But I remember coming all the way, driving from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, up to my home where I live on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, so all the way up the East Coast. And when I got there and I did my last weigh-in for my DIY move and all this, the Marine Corps sent me a check and they're like, okay, you're done. I'm like, what? I hadn't even really thought about that. It's like, we're done with you. We've closed the book on you. You've got your DD 214. You've got, your service record book. Like you had great honorable discharge. Awesome. See you later. And I was just like, whoa, I am out here now. And I guess I don't know what I really expected. That's what I wanted. They didn't, force me to get out, but I made that choice. And so when I think about it, it was really about perseverance because it did not end. That transition, I don't even know how you would mark it. I had thought about a year before I got out. I thought about the transition, certainly while I was in the midst of it and I'm weighing trucks and doing stuff. That was definitely a transition time. But if you ask me, like, when did you fully assimilate back into civilian life? I don't know how I would really answer that because it took a long, long time. If you really get down to all the parts of the mindset and the way I would dress and things that I had to learn for the first time that I just kind of took for granted from when I was in. There's so much infrastructure provided to you otherwise. And so what happened is, I would say at this point, I came to this crossroads. And so I'm zipping around my little race car track. I did my 6 years. I learned so many great lessons. I really enjoyed. I have nothing but good things to say about my military experience. But what happened is I found that military experience, while it helped me in so many ways, it didn't fully prepare me for civilian life and what was going to come next. And I found basically that I experienced the limitations, I would say, of focus. Focus as an approach is absolutely fantastic and necessary to achieve goals and to accomplish things. But I started to find that there are limitations with a focus-only approach. And the first one is this. When I was in the service, they taught me that the priorities are mission accomplishment, troop welfare, in that order. And it makes sense. In the military, we have a job to do. And if we can provide for troop welfare, that's great. But certainly in the Marine Corps, in my experience, that's definitely second on the list. And it could be a distant second, depending on the situation. When I got into the civilian world, I found that was not the mentality that worked with my coworkers, for example. When I'm like, we're going to stay late and work on this marketing report. Yeah, no, it doesn't quite carry the same weight as the security of our nation, right? It's mission accomplishment when your mission is somewhat smaller than that. It's almost it's a little bit difficult to get them to see things that way, which now I understand it completely. So it's almost as if mission accomplishment and troop welfare, again, even those terms, we would use things like job performance and employee engagement or employee experience would be kind of on par with one another in a best case scenario. And so that was one thing I found, is that this overly focused approach that was devoid of some of the people part, or at least a secondary, was not a great fit in that regard. But the second bit that I found also was this developmental mindset. So when I went to boot camp, I was transformed. And over the 6 years that I was in, I continued to learn about leadership and continue to go through that type of transformation. And I really enjoyed it. And when I got to the civilian world and I took my first job at a software company, I had other coworkers that wanted to learn things. They wanted to, in some ways, they wanted to be a little bit like me. They were like, oh, you're just so reliable or disciplined. I'm like, well, it's easy now compared to what I've been through. This is a piece of cake. But they would say, well, can you help us with some stuff? Can you teach us? I said, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I'd be honored. Let's get to this. And in my mindset, development was all about like 24/7 for 13, 16 weeks, whatever boot camp is now. That is an intense period of transformation. And what I knew from going through it was that they strip you down to nothing and start to give you back pieces of your professional life, one bit at a time. It's very effective, but it's very intense, obviously. And so for some reason, I had this mentality with my coworkers And they'd say, yeah, we can make half an hour a week, to sit down with you. And I was like, oh, there's not much we can accomplish together in terms of rewiring your mindset and doing these things. And it was a total disconnect in terms of how the demands of the job or the expectation or just the sheer amount of time you spend with one another doesn't allow for development the way that I had experienced it myself. So again, this overly focused approach, or at least a singularly focused approach, wasn't quite getting it done. The other one that I found was meaning. Obviously, when you are in the service, you've answered the call to protect your nation and to serve and these great things. And then you get to the civilian world, and some people who've never had that before, that meaning is absent. And it's hard to, like in my software company, it was a great company, but at the same time, what we were working on was not life or death. It wasn't saving the nation. It was just, it's a job, and it was great. And so you have to kind of find your own meaning. It doesn't come from the institution. And even the most well-intentioned nonprofits, et cetera, it's going to pale in comparison to what you would have experienced in the military. So for me, that was an adjustment. And then finally, there's this cyclic notion to life in the outside world. So one example is just you can experience these headwinds. One example was economics. So when there was in my time, the economy always goes through periods of boom and bust. It's just kind of how it is. And you think about on Wall Street, they talk about the bulls and the bears. And so in my career already, I've lived through at least 3 major economic hardships. If you think about, like, at the turn of the millennia, there was this dot-com bust. And this is kind of what I entered into when I separated from the service. Then there was a housing crisis. Then the pandemic did this too. And all kinds of things like start to create these setbacks. And so there's these headwinds that you're somewhat isolated from when you're in the military, because they're not going to run out of money. There are obviously budgetary constraints, but it doesn't quite work the same way as it can in the civilian world. Right now, we're seeing a lot of layoffs because people are concerned, for example, about the recession and the economy. So those headwinds were new for me too. It's a very different type of friction that you experience versus when you're in the service. And so as I'm watching all of this take place, I'm trying to process this, and I'm like watching people around me. I've always been a very observant person. I started to notice something that I now call the 3 killer bees. And that relates to being, belonging, and something bigger than myself. And I call these the killer bees because these are needs that we have as humans. And when these needs go unmet, it kills our productivity, our performance, our happiness, our intent to stay, all of these things. Being, belonging, and something bigger than myself. The implications of that I didn't really appreciate at first, but as I reflected on and I thought about military experience, there was a lot of those needs that were automatically met just by being in the military. So when you think about being, like, who am I? Well, I earned a title. They'll never take away from me now the fact that I'm a U.S. Marine, and I worked hard for it. I was proud of it. I'm still proud of it. That part of my being need was absolutely met. What about belonging? Oh, I love the people that I worked with. We were in a 6-man team in my recon. I did a couple deployments. Like, we really got to know each other, really enjoyed being with one another. We performed at an extremely high level. Okay, that's pretty cool. And what about something bigger than yourself? Well, that's easy. Service. I mean, we're protecting the nation. We're doing all these great things. It was just kind of wired into the fabric of what we signed on the line to do. When you start looking in the civilian world, all those needs are still there, but you have to meet them yourself. So when you think about being, it's like, who am I? You have to kind of fight for that and create your own identity, however you might choose to do that. And what about belonging? Like, those sort of relationships, you have to foster and nurture those yourself. And it's very rewarding. I don't want to make it seem like this is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. It's just that there's a shift from the institution providing you with these things to now you're kind of responsible and accountable for developing and making sure your needs get met, because nobody's coming. Nobody's going to do it for you. They've all got their own, they bring their own stuff to the party, so to speak. So that was an example. The other thing I found is that there were a lot of people around me that, because they weren't automatically meeting these needs, they were unhappy. So a lot of times people are grumpy at work because they just didn't have these needs that are met. They weren't really comfortable with who they could be at work. They were hiding away parts of themselves, or they didn't have strong working relationships. It was a little more transactional at work, or whatever it might be. And so when you're around other people who are in pain, you kind of pick up on that, because it can have this sort of contagion sort of effect. So you have to be prepared for that as well. That's why I took such a keen interest in them, and later studied psychology and organizational leadership and these sorts of things. And then finally, that even once you get all these needs met, things can change. I talked about some of the headwinds before, their life circumstances. It's not as volatile perhaps as battlefield conditions, but there is a notion that even if you work with somebody who's like, oh, I'm doing great, they could get laid off, or somebody else could get laid off and their workload just went up. Like there's things that happen that can challenge sort of the equilibrium that people find, even if they do satisfy those needs for some period of time. So I'm watching all this stuff with great curiosity, the people around me, and I'm like, okay, why is this happening? And it really got my attention when it happened to me. Now, all of a sudden, I couldn't just be curious about it. I had to do something about it. And what happened was during the pandemic, everybody kind of experienced varying degrees of challenges to these three killer bees. And what I found is that a lot of people, especially like myself, went through this reprioritization of our values. What was really most important to us? And I was forced to take a look at my life, and I had accomplished a lot of things at work and beyond, but I wasn't fully satisfied and happy. I wasn't living the way that I wanted to live. And I had to take action because even beyond the Marines, I definitely had this sense of personal responsibility and accountability. I had to do something about it. So what I found for me, the path, this is just me personally, I found my path out of a dark place that I was in through meditation and through study of Buddhist philosophy and different mindfulness techniques that helped me understand kind of what I was experiencing in a different way. And what I realized was there was this imbalance that I was bringing in terms of focus. And there wasn't this integration of another piece, the other key that we'll talk about here in just a second, that was helping me really find my footing, so to speak. And what I came to learn is that when you bring in this second element, we don't have to say mission accomplishment, troop welfare in that order. We can have both, and the activities we take can produce both. And so that second key that I want to tell you about is called flexibility. And so in terms of balancing the focus with flexibility, I started to understand that I needed to bring more elements to the table. I didn't want to lose what I had on the diagram you saw from my military background. I couldn't if I tried, to be honest. But I knew I had to do something a little bit differently. And so the first thing that I want to point out is talking about mindfulness. Now, I mentioned that I'm a meditator, but you don't have to be a meditator to find mindfulness, not by any stretch. You might be into yoga, you could be into music, maybe prayer, quiet reading, long walks in nature, doesn't matter. To me, the conditions of mindfulness are that there's a quietness, you can kind of slow down some of the noise happening around you, that there's the sense of presence, like here in the moment now, you're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about the future, like now is kind of the only time you have to work with. And there's this expansive notion, this openness to your thinking. To me, those are some of the hallmarks of mindfulness. I'll give you an example, like as a hobby, I got into, recently, this is going back probably about 2 years, I got into alpine rock climbing, ice, rock, all kinds of fun stuff. And I was up in New Hampshire, up in the White Mountains, and doing some training with a guide who runs a guide service out there, and had top rope. I'm climbing and all these kinds of things. And one day, I'll never forget, he calls down to me. He goes, "You still thinking about all those unread emails?" Because I was complaining about work and just being so absorbed with work. And I yelled back up to him, "No, I'm trying not to fall." I was so concentrating on my footholds and my handholds and the fingers and the pain and trying to figure out my route and all this. I wasn't anywhere else but there. And it was such a piercing, beautiful moment for me of mindfulness. I was like, I don't do this enough. It's such a reconnection with nature and big and all these things. And I couldn't think about anything else in the other part of my life because of the situation demanded it. And it was pure bliss in that moment. And so I've gone back to the mountains many times, and I tend to have that experience more often than not, where you just kind of lose yourself, and it just helps you reconnect with reprioritization like that. So whatever mindfulness means to you, it's just kind of slowing down the surface level commotion that takes place for all of us in our chatty kind of minds, and finding that place to sit down and say, okay, to balance the focus and to develop flexibility, create a healthy distance from thoughts and feelings and fear and anxiety and some of the frustration and the ego things that kind of rip us apart a little bit. Mindfulness can help sort of quiet that down and create space for them to dissipate on their own. That was a major, major revelation for me, because what I found when I had this focus sort of mindset, I got performance out of it. I just didn't get happiness. And at some point in my life, I realized I kind of want both. You can call it selfish if you want, but I definitely thought I want to keep the performance, but I also want to introduce the happiness and contentment. And so I had to add new tricks to my bag, so to speak. So mindfulness was the first one. So I ask you to think for yourself as you're making this transition. There's no better time. Our crossroads, our transition times, there's great opportunity in them. And so if you don't have any mindfulness practice like listening to music or taking walks or whatever it might be, this could be a good time to think about it, because you're going to go through a natural upheaval cognitively, emotionally. It's a very fertile space. And so if you haven't thought about it too much, and it doesn't take a ton of time, but it might be worth looking into for sure. The next one I talk about is acceptance. Now, there are certain things in life that we just accept to be true, right? Water's wet, sky's blue. Those are easy ones. Some other things that we can't control are harder to accept. I find that in our Western culture in particular, we try to control things through technology, through our own actions, whatever it might be. And some things we have to learn to accept are just outside of our control. If I have a headache, I take an aspirin. I had a shoulder injury, I was sore in the shoulder. I got my shoulder repaired. It's good as new, right? So there's lots of things in our life that tells us that we can just control everything. But not everything can be controlled, unfortunately. And there's a certain natural evolution and elements of life where discomfort is going to be present. This week, my dog's not feeling so well. I can tell he's not his normal perky self. He's a chocolate lab. His name's Gunner. Love that dog. He's 13 and a half years old. Now, in people years, that puts him about 93. As much as I love that dog is going to die someday. And that's not a reason to be sad or anything like that. That's a natural part of the process. And to be honest with you, I'm going to die too. And that's okay. Now, that's big A acceptance. I'm not asking you to go there and take a master class on how to come to grips with something like that. But if we think about little A acceptance, you're immediately going to be faced with things that are beyond your control that you can't change. And you can either be frustrated about them, or you can find this courageous and healthy way of practicing the right amount of acceptance. One example I see quite often is that veterans have to go and translate the work that they did into civilian terms. And so you're faced with dumbass questions like, so I see that you were a machine gunner. How did machine gunning prepare you for a job at this pharmacy? And you're like, are we having this conversation? Really? This is unbelievable. And at some point, it's something we just have to accept, that it's on us to do the translation work, because civilians don't have the frame of reference of what our life was like when we stepped away from civilian world for however long your period of commission or enlistment was, and now you're re-entering. Or if you're a military spouse, like, why have you moved around so much? Well, that's the job. It comes with the territory. So it comes along with this notion of acceptance. And so it's really important to be able to recognize that there's these realities of nature and life that are really important in that way. Another one is compassion. What I found in the Marines is that we were trained to bring a tremendous amount of violence to the enemy in order to overcome them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And they're very good at that. But when I got out, there were no more enemies. There wasn't my job anymore to sort of operate in violence. It was my job to work and understand other people's perspective and to empathize with them and to wish for them very well, and this compassion, I had to learn it and realize that it was a much better mode of operation. If we stick with this pharmacy example, let's say that I'm doing an interview with a young woman and she's the hiring manager and she's being very direct with me with her questions. It's very short. She's not giving me a lot of warm and fuzzy. I could have a focus approach and say, look, I'm getting this job, whether you like it or not. Even if I don't say it, that could be my attitude. It's not going to do too well for me, though. I can also choose to be compassionate. And I can say, I don't know 100% what her situation is. Did she have a lot of turnover in this role and she thinks I'm the next person that's going to be unreliable and quit on her? Did she have a tough day at home before she came to work? Did she get a piece of bad news that's affecting her? I have no idea. But no, I don't know her. I just met her 5 minutes ago, but I want her to be healthy and happy and safe. These are things I want for everyone. So I can demonstrate that kind of compassion, and it's going to soften a part of me that otherwise could look pretty hard. In this fictitious example, I'm a machine gunner, I'm a Marine, I'm probably pretty intense looking. I experienced that myself. And so it helps to bring that flexibility to offset some of that intense focus that naturally has been wired into me, for a long, long time. And so when I had no more enemies, as I looked around and all I saw were people who I could help and who I wanted to help me, compassion got me a lot better results and it felt a lot more natural to me. And I won't lie to you, it took a moment of adjustment. But when I realized that that was the situation, yeah, I enjoyed things a heck of a lot more. Another one we talk about is wisdom. Wisdom is this ability to see reality for what it is and not kind of live at the surface level. And the most simple example I can give you is when we're having a conversation. So, like, I'll stick with this interview example one last time. So, we're having a conversation. She's asking questions and I'm answering the questions. There's actually three conversations taking place. Scientists have studied this, and there's context. So, we're in an interview setting. She's trying to make a decision that, am I the right person for the job? I'm trying to make a decision. Do I really want to work here? There's all this context that's unspoken, but it's showing up in our communication. Then there's the content, the specific question she asks, the answers I give. You could read a transcript about it. That's content. That's the one we think about probably the most. And then there's nonverbal communication. My posture, am I leaning in? Am I leaning back? Am I mirroring her? These things are happening, often communicating each of us back and forth below a level of conscious communication. But it's happening. Scientists know this. We've studied this and started to realize that we may see on the surface that we're kind of thinking cognitively about, I can't wait for her to stop talking so I can say what I want to say next. That is a superficial, high level, surface level communication that's only a fraction. There's a part of her that knows you're just waiting to say something so for me to stop talking. And even if it doesn't register for her on her conscious level, her subconscious is picking that up. That's one small example about wisdom and understanding that if I can channel intent and I say, I want to make sure that we both make the best decision about working here. I want to make sure that you're getting the most authentic expression of me. I'm not afraid of the consequences one way or the other. Whatever it is that you're trying to communicate, if you can hold that in a part of you, your wisdom will pick up and say, there's a level of communication and connection between us that's beyond what it seems at the surface, which is pretty impressive. The last example I'll give you, I mentioned that being a recon Marine and with a 6-man team, we would pack to go out and basically march and hike and try to get to our insert spot. It could be 4 days in the field. When you're getting ready for that type of exposure out in the elements, you start to pack. And my pack would weigh, because we had batteries, radios, in addition to all the ammunition, everything else we had, would be definitely north of 80 pounds, probably closer to 90, 95 pounds at the beginning of a 4-day haul. If I had gone to them and said, yeah, you know what, I could get some sunscreen. Okay, I probably definitely want to have sunscreen, but I could use something like a pad for my back here. So I'll probably bring a chair. Would that be all right? And, a beach ball, because we might get bored out there. Let's bring it, and also start loading stuff up. Not only am I making life more difficult for myself, I'm slowing us down and potentially exposing the team to risk. So I need to bring the essentials for myself, but I need to not go too much further than the basics of what I need. And what I found in this path of flexibility is there's a certain amount of selflessness where once your basic needs are met and the more you can do to constrain those, anything more in terms of your own anxiety, your own self-judgment, your own sort of doubts, your own self-interest, your own interest in achieving your own goals and achievement, beyond that basic necessity level, it starts to work against you. When you can take interest in others, whether it's other people on the team, whether it's the collective mission of your team, like as soon as you turn up the volume on that and you can turn down the volume on yourself, again, not asking to be, I know it says selflessness, but not totally selfless. But as soon as you reach that minimum threshold, trying to make sure that your attention and your interest goes into everything else around you, that is a much, much better way to be. And so when you start looking at focus and flexibility together, and you look at these 10 different principles, it provides this sort of balance. And when we take away all of the noise and we look again at where we started, this is more than a racetrack. It's not just a figure eight with slot cars. This is actually a symbol, and you probably recognize it if you look at it now, as the infinity sign. And infinity is a concept that's really big to boil down into one symbol. But to me, this infinity sign is all about nature, like the infinite realm of space, the infinitely microscopic quantum realm, like anything you want to think about, just the vastness. It's incredible when you think about something that's truly infinite. Change is also infinite. And so, like little slot cars racing around the track, everything's always constantly evolving and changing, which means that in a time of transition, there's a lot of focus on making a kind of a C-level change of I was in the service and now I've separated, or I was a military spouse on base and now I'm a veteran spouse that's out in the civilian world, but everything's constantly in motion. And so when we bring in our two keys of focus and flexibility, it's not about going back and forth between one or the other. It's an integration of the two in harmony with this infinite reality that we're all a part of. That's the key to success. And the transition, again, that you're going through is this opportunity, if we look at it in the right way, to practice balancing and bringing these things together into a true integrated harmony with all the change that speaks. Now, when I bring back the 10 elements, if you ever find during your transition or in the aftermath of it that you feel like you're not at your 100%, there's something that's gone a little bit sideways for you, I'm going to ask you, if you were to call me, for example, I'd say, okay, on our roadmap, where did you stray from the path? How can we help you get back on the path? And you'd say, well, I know my priorities, but I'm waiting a little bit with passion. I'm just not that into what I'm working on. Great. Let's talk about that, right? This is a roadmap that we can use to say, am I doing the things on the focus side? Yeah, focus isn't the problem. It's some other things. Okay, great. Let's go into the flexibility side. How do we integrate all of these things? We don't lose anything. We want to integrate all of these things into what we bring out into the world. And so I promised you also that I would give you one bonus insight. And that bonus insight is this: to succeed, you need something else, but the good news is it's something that you already have. And that something is leadership. Jordana mentioned it at the top, and leadership is a critical element that I found the military life we thought about all the time. In civilian world, they don't talk about nearly as much as I personally believe that they should. But a lot of the people that you see around you who will be suffering because of a lack of leadership. It'll either be their own, and maybe they're caught up in their own sort of head trash, or maybe it'll be somebody around them who's acting not so artfully and it's causing an impinging upon them. A lack of leadership creates tremendous amounts of problems in organizations and in our society as a whole. So when I was going through this process and I was thinking about, I'm sitting on the cushion and I'm trying to figure out through my meditation, I found this framework that I now teach to leaders, and I want to share it with you real quickly here. And I call it Expand the Circle. So this is something that I've written up in a book. It'll come out in March. I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can get the free access to the book and everything, a sneak preview in just a minute. But what I teach leaders now and what I've taught for myself, and I've been so happy about how much of a difference it's made, begins with lead yourself. When you think about ripples emanating out, if you drop a pebble into the water and these ripples cascade out, when we start from the inside out, we start with leading yourself. You cannot effectively lead others until you learn to lead yourself. When we're talking about that here, we're talking about things like, how do you create awareness? Like, so many leaders lack self-awareness and they don't realize some of the challenges that they create for other people. How do we think about things like self-acceptance? You're going to find parts of you that you're just not that thrilled about, but rather than try to hide them away and hope nobody sees them, it's possible to incorporate them into your leadership and be more mindful about them. Or when we think about something like authenticity, how is it that I can truly step into my own leadership mantle? In the book, I share an experience from when I was actually at jump school, and it was my first time being in charge of a little fire team there of 4 people. And I didn't really know how to be a leader in that context. So I just emulated what I thought other Marines leaders would do. And it was a terrible idea because it was not a good fit at all. I wasn't being authentic. So I had to learn my own authentic leadership style as a result. Once you go and you've started working on leading yourself, you're ready to lead one other person. One other person. Could be a coworker, could be somebody who works directly for you, depending on your seniority and when you make your transition, what kind of job you're going to take. But leading others comes down to things like empathy. Can I really sort of project and experience the feelings that somebody else is feeling? What about things like trust? Can I establish trust between another person? Am I willing to give trust? Am I willing to extend and rebuild relationships that are based on trust, or something like connection, like the nature of connection between us? Get a little more complex when you get into the team dynamic. Now, all of a sudden, you have different personality types, people working together. If you have a collective that you're either a part of or that you're leading, now we need a vision. What's the picture of success look like for our team? So I teach leaders how to talk about how to develop vision, how to communicate and articulate that vision through story. These things become important. What about team identity? Something I took for granted in the military. I was always identified with recon teams, whatever it might be. Get to the civilian world, teams don't have names. It's hard to incorporate a team identity into your own identity when you're like, oh, I'm on the accounting team. Well, that's not very inspiring. Or these types of things like that are so essential that we learn in the military are kind of absent in the civilian world in ways that I don't really understand or enjoy so much. And then what about cooperation? Again, something that we knew in the military, that we had to cooperate and sometimes sacrifice some aspect of our own welfare or goals in support of a greater, a different unit that might need our help or resources more than we do, whatever it might be. These things they're not you can't take them for granted. They're not necessarily freely given in the civilian world the same way. When you get out to the organization level, we typically think about CEOs and other types of C-level people that are responsible for leading organizations, but I disagree. I see that there's the same thing we saw in the military. We have leaders at every level. The very first thing I got in boot camp, right after my shaved head, which apparently stuck, I got a book of leadership principles, because they're like, I don't care if you're a private, you will be a leader, of whatever task you have been assigned. And so leaders at every level are responsible for organization. If you don't set the culture, your job is to reinforce the culture or make decisions in line with it. Or what about the mission of the company? These types of things are really important. And then finally, having your leadership spill out into the world beyond the confines of the organization. Again, it came very natural for us in the military because we were serving this greater good of the American way of life and society and things. It's possible for us even when we're not in the military. When you think about our families, how can the success I have at work spill over into my family context? How can I bring it into my community? And I give Jordana and the recon team a lot of credit. The community doesn't just mean geographic boundaries. It also means communities of interest, like veterans, and doing work to help. So these are ways that you can lead out into the world beyond even the confines of your own organization. And finally, beyond sustainability on the planet and out into whatever's bigger than that, the unknowable questions that we all have to reconcile for ourselves. This is all showing up as a leader in the world. So I'm just about to the end of my time here, Ben. I wanted to say thank you. And you're going to hear it 100 times. Thank you for your service. And I do mean that. I mean, thank you for your service. I know what a sacrifice it can be. Obviously, I lived it. But I also want you to think of this. When I say thank you for your service, I don't just mean your military service in the past. I want to thank you for your service in terms of your now. Your ability to not just use focus to get your own goals achieved, but to demonstrate flexibility, a type of compassion and wisdom and mindfulness that helps you show up as a leader in your communities and to benefit those around you. That's the service I want to thank you for too. So whenever inevitably you're going to go to the mall, somebody's going to find out you're in the military and say, thank you for your service. Hear me saying, yeah, me too. Thank you for your service. Only I'm talking about where you go from here, not where you've been. Because both are equally important to me. When you get on the outside, it's just different out here. There's so many great things happening, but there's such a need for the next level leadership that I know that you can provide. So that's when I say thank you for your service. I mean both. I mean your service to your country through your veteran service, but also thank you for the service that you can provide every moment of every day to those around you. And so with that, I'll close with this. The book that I mentioned, Expand the Circle, comes out in March. I want to give you a sneak peek of it. I'd love to send you some preview chapters. When I have the whole thing, I'll email it to you. You can have it. I'd love for you to have it. You can follow and connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you go to the booth that I have as well, you can click the I'm interested button, and I'll make sure to send you some early copies as I work on it leading up to the March date. So Jordana, that's what I've got for you today. Thank you again for your time and your attention. I hope you found some nuggets in there from the 2 keys that we went through together, as well as the 10 principles and the bonus about what I call an enlightened leadership framework.
Matt, thank you so much. That was just an amazing, I think everyone here would agree with me. That was just an amazing way to start today. So thank you so much for your time and for bringing your insights to the table. Everybody else, we've got about 10 minutes before our next session starts. So here's a few things that you can do. you can head over to the expo. Go visit Matt's booth. Go ahead and sign up if you're interested, and get an early copy of his book. I promise you it is worth it. Check out some of our sponsor booths while you're over there. Also, if you're bored, just want to meet somebody new, head over to the lounge, take a seat, and hopefully someone will join you there and you'll be able to have a quick conversation. We'll be back here in about 9 minutes for the next session with Enrique Acosta Gonzalez. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt, again for your time, and thank you for your service.